Now the Chinese variation of the dragon is yet another adaptation that evolved out of both players, on white or black, gaining some advantage by having some new move or some novelty, as we say in chess. Garry Kasparov and Vishy Anand, both former world champions, were playing in a really important match in the 1990s, and they were introducing new moves into this very old opening. And it was found that certain moves changed the advantage from black to white or vice versa. And so then one of the moves that avoided one of those other lines was a move we're going to learn in this lesson that turns it into the so-called Chinese dragon. And it also, once again, it changes the nature of the opening, and it will take you into another very interesting line. And so we start out with the very typical dragon, and then we get down into like the 10th or 11th move before we change something, and it's black that makes the adaptation. So again, we're going to see the familiar opening, and you're going to want to see it lots of times so you can see the patterns and the different changes. And a lot of times it'll transpose. The move order won't be exactly the same as this, but it will transpose into the moves that we see. So same thing, d6, trade off this pawn, take out the knight, go into the dragon, play f3, normal stuff, castle. They set up their Yugoslav attack position, take our knight out, they castle. We got to put our bishop on d7. Pretty much any time we play the dragon, we got to put the bishop there. It doesn't make sense to go anywhere else. However, sometimes I should note that we may, at some point in the game, decide that we trade off this knight in order to surprise our opponent, or depending on what's going on in the game exactly, it may behoove us to have our bishop here on e6 aimed over at the king over on this square right here, depending on where the pieces are. Usually you don't want to block in your pawns, the bishop. So this move looks kind of weird if your goal is going to later on to be to move your pawns forward and attack the center. But in the dragon variation of the Sicilian, we're not really doing that. We're going to be attacking the queen side. So we can put the bishop here, and with that knight gone that was on d4, we don't have to worry about a knight coming down and attacking its bishop. So actually, it really can't be dislodged very easily. It also, in this case, it stops the white bishop coming down to c4 into that really strong square that it was being put on before. And if they want to do something like play pawn to b3 in order to put that bishop here, well, then we'll trade it off and we'll give them an ugly stacked pawn position in front of their king. That wouldn't work very well for them. So sometimes you want to mix it up, especially if your opponent's really familiar with the lines you're already playing. Knowing that you can do this, trade that knight off and put the bishop right here, it's yet another way to play the position. And now we have two bishops aimed at the king side. In this case, the dark squared bishop of white is now aimed across from ours though, which is not really great, because then if we move this knight, it can be traded off. It's just a theme that's worth knowing about, that you want to have the option to be able to do. And again, it can surprise your opponent if they're not expecting you to do that. Okay, so we're going to go the main line again, bishop here to d7. And oftentimes, white, they'll take their bishop out, like I said, or they'll immediately adjust their king. This is something that is a strong move, because it just makes it so that later on when the black attacks comes, it's in a good position. It also avoids, like if the white or the black queen goes here and this knight moves somewhere later on, it avoids this queen being captured and traded off with a check. And so that's kind of an important thing. Like for example, if this knight goes here and we want to trade off the queens now and go into a queenless game, this knight could take this pawn with check, assuming this knight was gone. Let's say, for example, the move order went, takes this knight, we take back, and then he goes here. Since this queen's not defended, we can't take this knight right now. We'd lose our queen. We pretty much have to take the queen. But since we're not taking the queen with check, he has this in-between move, like we say, called an intermediary move or in-between move. He can take this pawn right here with check, and now he won a pawn. I got to move my king, and now he takes back the queen, and he's won a pawn, and his knight's in an annoying spot. And we can attack that. In this situation, it looks like he can't get out without losing material. I'd have to analyze this more to see if it works or not. But this is a common theme that happens depending on what the situation is and the move order. This happens sometimes. So that's one of the reasons why white wants to move the king over, among many reasons. The other one being just to keep it safe. It's not as safe when it's on this position right here, and we are going to be attacking on that side. So let's just say he goes ahead and moves that king over right away. Well, one thing we can do, we can immediately move the queen out like we said we were going to, although in this particular situation, moving the queen out here, it loses this really annoying knight to b3, and then we just have to move it back. And if we move it back here, the knight can attack it again, and we can put it here. And actually, if we put our queen here in this situation, it looks kind of ugly, like it's not in a good spot. But later on, depending on what white does, let's say for example, I don't know, white decides to move his bishop out now, which wouldn't be a very good thing to do. The knight's right here. It actually makes less sense. So in this situation, it would make more sense for white to put their knight or their bishop right here, and that will support the pawn storm. But just for an example, if this does happen, now you can knock this knight back, and now we can start a pawn storm, and actually our queen is now in a really good position to push this pawn forward, and we have a really powerful attack. So now, let's say for example, we go like this, we dislodge this knight immediately, he's got nowhere to go except for maybe he can go here, and then we can attack it with this, and it's just going to lead to a really interesting game. I mean, he can trade these things off, but we have an attack going on here. And now later on, even though we just made some trades, we're going to be able to say, whatever, we're going to be able to attack here, and it's going to be a really interesting race for a checkmate. And both sides' attacks are coming really fast. That's just an example of what can happen. But I would prefer not to go down into that line, so I wouldn't play this queen move to a5 yet. When this knight is here, I wouldn't do it. What usually happens is that this bishop will come out first, and then we can play, and then we wait for him to tuck it over to b3, and then we can play the queen out. But we're right now learning about the Chinese dragon, right? So the typical move in the Chinese dragon in this position will be to play rook to b8, or we can play knight to e5. So the move order is really interesting. It just depends. If we play knight to e5 first, and they want to kick our knight off, now we can attack the bishop, and the only place it has to go is all the way back here in order to keep itself. So that's fine. Later on, we can put it back here. That's something that's really annoying. That can happen if we play that move first. Or we play this move, and they don't want to do that, so they won't play that move, and they will just continue to develop. They will then bring their bishop out. This is the main line. Oh, they can't do it yet because of knight. Sorry. Let's go back. I just want to show you guys the main Chinese line. So you would play rook to b8 here. This is a lot different than bringing these pieces out and moving the rook over. And by doing this, you're saying that you're going to push this pawn forward and you're going to attack this way. And it tends to work really well, and it can surprise your opponent when they're not ready for it. They're probably just going to say, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to bring my pieces out like I was and continue my attack. But now we can play a6 and a5, which means our attack will come quickly. We can attack the knight immediately right here, make him tuck away, which is what will usually happen, and now we just play b5. This is the main line. And even though you have two knights in this pawn, we have two pieces defending it, the bishop and the rook. We are also setting ourselves up to play knight to c4 and trade that off. And if we did trade that off in this position, let's say for example white plays here immediately, and now we go like this, white's pretty much going to be forced to take this knight because they don't want to trade off this dark squared bishop. And now we have a rook aimed at the king, and the queen can come over here, and we have a nice attack coming. That's one thing that could happen if they decide to go ahead and just pawn storm right away. Anything that opens up the position of the king, like if they want to play a6, for example, is not smart. We want to keep our king position flush and defend it with the pieces. We don't want to be moving the pawns in front of our king unless we absolutely have to, depending on the position. I mean, in this case, if they do that, we're going to open it up. We're going to be able to open this position up, and we're going to have a lot of threats. So it's not usually a good idea to do that. You know, so this is going to be a good position for black, and it leads to a slight variation on what we saw before that might surprise white. So white, instead of pawn storming right away, as we see that they have this move, it's kind of annoying, they might go ahead and try to trade off this bishop right away. And in this case, we're going to let them. We're going to go ahead and make this knight move, or let's say they take this bishop first. We take it back, the knight moves out of the way, and so we've allowed them to trade off a really good bishop. I said don't do that, but now the position is different. They haven't started their pawn storm yet, and so it's not as dangerous, and we have an attack in our own right coming. And so we can now push these pawns forward. Now if you notice, now they're going to have their pawn storm. Now it's tricky for them. See? He'd be forced to put his bishop here. Let's say we take it, we trade that off. He brings his pawn. Oh, he just took back. See, now we're attacking their king. And it's not easy for them to keep things closed. And so things are dangerous for white. They can try to keep it closed. We can take here. We can bring our pieces over. I'm just giving you guys examples. But now our pieces are coming swiftly. And even though they have an attack as well, tempo over here. Now we're going to lead into what usually happens towards the end of a well-played and hard-fought Sicilian game is that you will have a really sharp attack on both sides, as we saw with the original Dragons. One of the reasons why it's so fun to play, there's a lot of calculating that you'll need to do. I'm just giving you guys some examples. Once the position opens up or the game varies, you're going to see all different types of stuff happening, lots of fireworks. And so it's really fun, but knowing that you can play this rook to b8 and then push this pawn, it can change it up on your opponent, especially in a blitz game if you're playing a Sicilian against somebody over and over again, and they're used to seeing the regular Yugoslav attack in the normal Dragon setup. By varying and playing rook to b8, pushing that pawn forward, oftentimes black will get a decisive attack, and it can surprise your opponent. And that's what it's all about in the opening, and in blitz especially. Getting something that puts your opponent on the back foot and surprises them is a good thing. So it's definitely useful to have the Chinese Dragon variation ready to go in your back pocket when you need it.